is the bitter end of 1943. The Eastern Front, a grinding, brutal tableau of mud, ice, and blood, is slowly but inexorably tilting, not toward peace, but toward a new, terrifying phase of attrition. The conflict here is less a war of maneuver and more a desperate, intimate exchange of life for meters of scorched earth. Here, in the dense, shattered forests of the Dnieper Bend, we meet the primary element of our story, a man reduced to an animal and a weapon elevated to an extension of the soul. Sergeant Ivan Volkov, a veteran sniper of the Red Army, lay half-buried in the frozen detritus of a destroyed German strongpoint. His reputation preceded him like a ghost. In the official ledgers of the 43rd Guards Rifle Division, he was credited with 237 confirmed eliminations. To the German line opposite, he was simply Der Falk, the Falcon, a silent harbinger of death capable of threading a bullet through a slit trench from distances exceeding 600 meters. But the Falcon had fallen. A mortar shell, a random cruel whisper of steel, had detonated too close. It wasn't the shrapnel that broke him, but the sheer kinetic force, slamming his torso against the buttress of a ruined farmhouse. His left leg, a critical tool for stability and movement, was twisted and useless, the pain a cold, blinding fire. His weapon, the revered Mosin Nagant 9130 with its PU scope, lay next to him, miraculously intact, but useless without the strength to steady it. The immediate drama, however, was not the pain nor the enemy, but the clock. The German counter-barrage was methodical, creeping closer. Ivan, the master of silent, calculated patience, was now exposed, stranded between the enemy's forward listening post and the precarious, contested line of the Soviet advance. He knew the tactical rule. A wounded soldier is a liability, often sacrificed for the good of the unit. His comrades, if they were to survive the coming push, would not return for him. This is the central irony of the war's deadliest profession. The sniper, who operates in the shadow of the action, relies on perfect anonymity. When exposed, their highly specialized training becomes a target, an insult to the enemy's morale. To be captured wounded, particularly on the Eastern Front, was not an option. As the smoke began to thin, Ivan saw the full scale of the devastation around him. The farm complex, designated simply Objective 7 on the maps, was less a village and more an ash pit. The tactical fire that had cleared it had consumed everything. No livestock, no supplies, no shelter. Just the skeleton of stone, timber, and the omnipresent scent of scorched earth. He needed to move. Every instinct, every twitch of his highly tuned nervous system screamed for escape. But the cold was his enemy now, seizing his muscles, amplifying the shock. It was here, amidst the ruins, that the strategic narrative of the war met the intimate drama of survival. The front, defined by grand movements of divisions and tanks, often forgot the tiny, vulnerable pockets of humanity trapped between the warring behemoths. Suddenly, a flicker of movement. Not military, not disciplined, but desperate and low to the ground. Near what was once a well, shielded by a remaining section of wall, something stirred. It was not a soldier. Slowly, carefully, a figure emerged. A young woman, perhaps barely 20, thin as a rail, clutching something to her chest. Behind her, two smaller shapes, children, wide-eyed and terrified. They were the ghosts of Objective 7, the forgotten civilians. They were starving, their eyes hollowed out by fear and want fixed on the man with the rifle. Ivan Volkov, the legendary Falcon, whose sole purpose was to erase human life with surgical precision, was now face to face with human vulnerability that could not be targeted. This is the moment of our first critical shift. The narrative of the war for Ivan had always been black and white, enemy and comrade, survival and mission. Now a third category had emerged, the innocent, a burden of conscience in a place where morality had been long since incinerated. He had a single field dress bandage, a half ration of stale black bread, and his rifle. His tactical dilemma was now a moral one. Ignore them, preserve his own minimal chance of survival, and risk their desperate noise betraying his position. Or engage, give up his only sustenance, and condemn himself to a slower death by exposure. but perhaps buy himself a moment of silence. The children, recognizing the uniform, or perhaps the sheer exhausted humanity in his eyes, took a tentative step toward him. Their desperation overcame their fear. They weren't seeing a sniper. They were seeing a source of salvation. The irony is profound. A man whose profession is isolation and destruction must now rely on an act of communal, self-sacrificial kindness to survive the next hour. The battlefield, usually defined by the trajectory of a bullet, was about to be redefined by the trajectory of a single act of compassion. If you are finding this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more untold tales of history's most critical conflicts and the human stories hidden within them. The children's footsteps were feather-light, yet in the deadly stillness between the volleys of artillery, they sounded like the pounding of a drum. Ivan, his breath ragged, raised a hand, not the rifle, but his empty, bloodied hand, to stop them. Any sudden movement would draw the eye of the forward German spotter, watching from a line of pine trees 300 meters away. He realized the severity of their starvation instantly. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Anya, moved with a kind of slow, deliberate energy, conserving every calorie. Her eyes weren't just terrified. They were calculating, focused with the singular, feral intensity of a mother protecting her young. This was the same relentless drive that propelled the troops on both sides, stripped down to its most basic, pre-industrial form, survival. Ivan's military training had drilled into him the concept of resource allocation. One ration was designed to sustain one combat soldier for 24 hours of high-stress activity. To split it was to weaken himself critically. Yet, the tactical imperative of silence superseded the biological need for food. He slowly reached into his tunic and produced the half ration of black bread. It was hard, almost petrified by the cold, but it was sustenance. He pushed it along the dirt toward Anya. "Quiet," he mouthed, the single syllable a harsh rasp in his throat. "The enemy is close." Anya did not hesitate. Her gratitude was not expressed in tears or words, but in action. The focused, rapid movement of tearing the bread and distributing fragments to the children. She chewed slowly, her eyes darting between Ivan and the direction of the German lines. She understood the unspoken covenant. He gives them life. They give him silence and obscurity. Ivan's mind, despite the throbbing pain in his leg, began to work on the problem of his survival, incorporating these three new, utterly non-military factors. The objective was no longer just escape. It was concealment until nightfall, followed by an agonizing crawl toward the Soviet lines. He was immobile, and they were his unwitting camouflage. The strategic blunder of the German command became apparent in this micro-environment. They had burned the village to deny cover and resources to the advancing Soviets, but in doing so, they had inadvertently left behind 3 civilian observers. These civilians, accustomed to living in the rubble, knew every fissure, every shadow, every safe hollow. Anya pointed, not with her finger, but with a subtle tilt of her head, toward a collapsed cellar underneath the main structure. It was an access point only a local would know, shielded from direct view by the fallen stonework. It was tight, perhaps too small, but it was cover. The move was the most dangerous part. Ivan used his rifle as a crude crutch, dragging his dead weight. The crunch of his boots on the frozen earth was deafening in his ears. Anya, showing a remarkable, untaught efficiency, took the rifle and helped support his shoulder, the heavy weapon an awkward burden in her slight frame. The irony was once more palpable. Der Falke was being supported by the very civilians his war had sought to destroy or ignore. They reached the cellar opening. It was narrow, forcing Ivan to discard his pack and weapons first. He slid down, biting back a scream as the weight shifted onto his shattered leg. Anya and the children followed, pulling the heavy door of splintered wood over the opening, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. They were in a space no larger than a shallow grave, smelling of wet earth, rot, and fear. Below the ground, Ivan began to assess his resources, tactical and personal. His medical kit was minimal, a few morphine syrettes, which he knew he needed to save for the final, unbearable push, and some basic field dressing. His ammunition count: 30 rounds for the rifle, 22 for the TT-33 pistol. His binoculars, compass, and map case were intact. Anya, meanwhile, was not idle. She had salvaged something from the cellar: a blackened, rusted pail, and an old oil lamp, which she dared not light. She whispered, her voice a dry rasp, explaining that there was a cistern beneath them. Water, contaminated but essential. "The Germans use this area for observation, Gvardia," she whispered, using the respectful term for a guardsman. "They will patrol the burned fields at dusk. They have not found this cellar." Ivan was stunned by her clarity and her immediate grasp of the tactical situation. She wasn't just a refugee. She was a survivor who had observed the routines of her oppressors. This wasn't passive hiding. It was active intelligence gathering. He realized the true value of the exchange. He had given them bread, a finite resource. They had given him time, information, and concealment, infinitely more valuable assets in this war of milliseconds and shadows. But the most shocking observation was yet to come. As the day wore on, and the deep seismic sounds of the distant artillery continued, Ivan's pain began to dull the sharp edges of his survival instinct. He noticed the two children huddled next to Anya. Their faces were smeared with soot and dirt, but their hands, as they slowly ate the bread, were remarkably clean. Anya, he saw, had a small, finely carved piece of wood hanging on a leather thong around her neck. It was not a religious icon, but something much rarer on this scorched earth. A small, intricately carved chess piece. A knight. The mystery deepened. Who were these people? Starving refugees usually discarded anything non-essential. A fine carving suggested a past life of culture, not peasant farming. And why the clean hands in a sea of ash? It was a contradiction that troubled the sniper's precise, analytical mind. The Falcon, master of the long, clear view, was now trapped in the dark, dependent on the unseen geometry of this hidden family. Do not let these hidden stories fade into the past. Join our community and subscribe now to ensure you receive the next chapter of this incredible true-life saga. The cellar was a vault of silence, save for the rhythmic, distant pulse of the front, the thump of heavy artillery, the staccato bark of machine guns. For Ivan, the transition from hunter to hunted, from mobile weapon to static liability, was psychological agony. His only recourse was observation and interrogation. The tools of the mind, now critical substitutes for the tools of the body. He focused on Anya. Her vigilance was unsettling. It surpassed mere fear. It was professional. Every time the sound of a nearby German patrol, the specific, heavy thud of jackboots on frozen ground, drew close. She didn't just freeze, she anticipated. She would gently guide the children, Katya and Boris, into deeper shadow, and her eyes, even in the near darkness, seemed to be calculating the distance and trajectory of every noise. Ivan, conserving his whisper, tested her knowledge. "The supply route," he rasped, nodding to the northeast. "How often do they move the ammunition sleds?" Anya paused, contemplating the question with the seriousness of a staff officer. "Twice a day, before dawn for the morning push, and late evening after the main evening meal. They use the old quarry road. They believe the ice there is safer. The snow covers the tracks better." Ivan was instantly alert. The quarry road was a secondary route, often bypassed by Soviet intelligence, which focused on the main road. The German High Command, in their relentless pursuit of efficiency, had developed highly structured, almost bureaucratic patterns of movement, movements that often betrayed their strategic vulnerability. This wasn't local knowledge. This was tactical insight. "How do you know the routine so precisely?" Ivan asked, his voice low and suspicious. Snipers by nature trust no one. Partisans were one thing, but civilian observers were a massive, undocumented risk. Anya held up the small, dark, carved wooden knight. "My father, he was an engineer, not for the military but for the regional railway system. He taught me that everything that moves in a pattern, a rhythm. The railway schedule, the German supply lines, the flow of the Dnieper. If you can measure the rhythm, you can predict the movement." The revelation was chilling. Ivan, the master of the single, perfect moment of rupture, was speaking to someone who understood the logistical poetry of the entire front. He understood the tactical. She understood the industrial. The sheer scale of the war, the statistics of production and supply that determined victory, suddenly narrowed down to this starving family in a cold, damp hole. He realized the true, shocking significance of the clean hands. Her father, the engineer, the man who understood logistical patterns, had taught his children precision. Even in the chaos of starvation, they maintained a sense of order, a memory of a civilized life where detail mattered. The clean hands were a tiny act of rebellion against the barbarism surrounding them, a clinging to the pre-war reality. Ivan had to move now, or he would die. His leg was swelling badly. Gangrene was a very real, very swift executioner in the cold. He had to be back across the Soviet line before the next German logistical rotation, before dawn. He pulled out his map, a tattered, oil-stained Soviet General Staff overlay, and spread it flat on the dirt, using the pencil beam of his smallest emergency flashlight, shielded by a tattered cloth. "I need to cross the river here." Ivan indicated the Dnieper's most treacherous bend, notorious for swift currents and German observation posts. "There is a gap in the minefield at grid reference 3 to 4 Alpha, but it's heavily monitored." Anya leaned in, her eyes tracing the contour lines with a disturbing familiarity. "No, not there. The monitoring is based on a rotational shift change they instituted 2 weeks ago at 200 hours. The gap is still there, but the delay is the danger. They have laid down thin, tension trip wire at 3 to 4 Beta, exactly 50 meters north of your original gap. They do not report it to trap patrols. They are listening for the wire's vibration." Ivan felt a surge of cold dread, not from fear, but from the horrifying realization of the near disaster he had avoided. He, a decorated veteran, relying on outdated intelligence, had been walking directly into an undocumented, improvised trap. The arrogance of assuming he knew the ground better than the people who lived beneath it was nearly fatal. The war had always been presented to him as a contest of industrial power and tactical bravery. What he was witnessing now was a contest of information asymmetry, a deadly game where the enemy's deepest secrets were often held by the most unlikely of sources. The true twist in the German strategic playbook was their reliance on the belief that the local population was either too terrified or too uneducated to notice their routines. The irony was devastating. The logistical security designed by German engineers was being undone by the observational skills taught by a Russian railway engineer to his daughter. The radio, Ivan pointed to the small, damaged German field radio receiver he had salvaged from the destroyed post. "Can you make sense of their speech?" "My father," Anya repeated, "worked on the railway that extended into Poland. We learned their technical terminology for the machinery. I can understand the numbers and the code names." Ivan's pulse quickened. He realized he was not just hiding with a family. He was sheltering a highly specialized intelligence asset, a living decoder ring. He slowly pulled out the morphine syrettes, his last precious resource against the pain that threatened to cripple his mission. He had been saving them for the escape, for the moment of excruciating effort. Now, he reevaluated the risk. The pain was unbearable, but the necessity of clear thought, of being able to process Anya's incoming data, was paramount. "You are my eyes," Ivan said, looking directly into her eyes, the first time their gaze had met with mutual professional respect. "You tell me the pattern. I will use the pattern to survive. And if I survive, I will return. I promise you this." It was a soldier's pact, sealed not with a handshake, but with the cold, hard logic of survival. The next chapter of their survival would depend entirely on Anya's ability to decode the German operational tempo before the coming darkness. Ivan, the legendary sniper, was now utterly dependent on the engineering mind of a starving woman. This war of men and machines was about to turn on the quiet strength of an unforeseen asset. As the afternoon light faded into the gray, metallic hue of a winter sunset, the ambient noise of the battlefield intensified. The distant exchange of fire grew more urgent, signaling either a probing attack or a tactical repositioning. In the cramped, cold space of the cellar, the air grew thick with anticipation, and the raw, earthy scent of damp soil. Ivan, having administered a small dose of morphine, just enough to dull the screaming in his leg without clouding his mind, began to orchestrate their survival as a combined operation. Anya became his sensor array, his ears and eyes on the ground above. He asked her to describe, in detail, the recent movements of the German observation posts, OPs. Snipers are obsessed with the rhythm of the enemy's complacency, the predictable lapses in discipline that offer a window of opportunity. Anya detailed the shift changes at the three nearest OPs, Alpha 7, Beta 8, and Gamma 9. She noted that the patrol heading east from Beta 8 consistently stopped for 5 minutes at the burned-out tractor near the stream to smoke a cigarette, right at 1930 hours. "They talk about home," she whispered, a slight tremor in her voice. "About the letters. They stand with their backs to the forest, always." Ivan nodded, the sniper's logic clicking into place. 5 minutes of static exposure, facing away from the primary Soviet threat axis. It was a lapse born of cold, fatigue, and the deadly confidence of the rear guard. It was the crack in the facade of the Wehrmacht's legendary discipline. More critically, she described the radio traffic. The German forces used a constant low-level chatter for coordination, utilizing a complex system of code names for units, supply drops, and personnel. Using the salvaged German field receiver, Ivan tuned the dial, and Anya listened with an intense focus that transcended the noise. "They are speaking of a Viper shipment," she translated, her brow furrowed. "It is not food. It is too urgent. The word is repeated too many times. Viper is scheduled for pickup at the staging area near the bridge at 2100 hours. Ivan recognized the term instantly. Viper was the Allied intelligence code name for a newly deployed German anti-tank weapon, a heavy, mobile assault gun, likely the Ferdinand or its successor, carrying the terrifying new long-barreled 80mm gun. If the Germans positioned a battery of these new Vipers before the upcoming Soviet armor push, the Red Army offensive could stall into a bloody quagmire. The scope of his mission had just expanded exponentially. His survival was no longer just about saving himself. It was about preventing a catastrophic strategic reversal. He had been planning an escape. Now he was planning an intelligence extraction. The problem, however, was the extraction method. His leg was useless. He needed a diversion, a tactical rupture. And he needed to get Anya's information, the specifics of the minefield, the rotation times, the Viper intelligence, back to his command. He considered his options. The pistol fire would be too close, drawing immediate counterfire. The few remaining rifle rounds were for precision engagement only. Then, Anya offered the critical piece of the puzzle. They bring the gasoline to burn the bodies and the damaged equipment. They store the drums in the old cistern near the church foundation. 3 large drums. They think the smell of the earth covers the fuel smell. Ivan smiled, a grim, humorless twist of his mouth. The Germans, masters of technological warfare, were defeated by their own bureaucracy and their reliance on primitive tactics for cleanup. The very act of concealing the evidence of their losses became a tactical vulnerability. The Viper shipment, Ivan articulated slowly, mapping out the strategy. It must be neutralized. The cigarette break at 1930. The fuel at the cistern. We have a window. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. He needed to crawl, dragging his weight, nearly 200 meters from the cellar to the cistern. He needed to set the fuse, utilizing the few yards of captured fuse wire in his pack. Time to detonate just as the Viper staging area was being activated, drawing the full attention of the German rear echelon to the fire and sound. Anya realized the risk. "You cannot move that far, Gvardia. Your blood will track in the snow." "The snow is patchy," Ivan countered, "but the ground is frozen. I will crawl over the stone and the ash. My blood is a secondary concern. The primary is the Viper. If they put those guns at the river crossing, the 43rd Guards will be annihilated." The children, Boris and Katya, had been silent throughout, listening to the guttural exchanges in Russian and German, their faces reflecting the flickering, tense beam of the flashlight. Now Katya, the younger girl, offered another observation, her voice small but clear. "The dogs," she said. The border guards. They patrol with a Belgian shepherd. It always follows the edge of the river, where the ice is thin. It is trained to follow the fresh smell, the running water. Ivan dismissed the dog initially, a minor threat. But tonight, Katya insisted, her eyes wide with the certainty of a child who had watched the same ritual daily. They use two, the old one and the new one. The new one does not listen, it only pulls on the lead. The observation was terrifyingly accurate. German patrol dogs, particularly the new recruits, were notorious for their unpredictable behavior, often breaking cover or reacting to unseen stimuli. The introduction of a wild card into the patrol routine complicated the escape immensely. Ivan realized that the only way to avoid the predictable patrol path, Anya's knowledge, and the unpredictable dog, Katya's knowledge, was to move during the detonation. The noise, the smoke, and the subsequent German panic would override the dog's senses and the patrol's routine. The clock was now the main enemy. 1800 hours, 90 minutes until the cigarette break, which would serve as the first necessary diversion. Ivan carefully checked his TT-33 pistol, removing the magazine and wiping the frost from the rounds. He handed the rifle, his beloved Mosin Nagant, to Anya. "This is not for the Germans," he instructed, his voice grave. "It is for you. If I do not return by midnight, you use the gap I described to leave. You go south. If you are caught, you do what you must. But you survive. The information, the Viper, the minefield at Beta, is the key. It must get through." Anya took the cold, heavy rifle, its telescopic sight reflecting the dim light like a cyclops' eye. For the first time, the starving mother looked like a combatant. The sniper had not only saved a family, but had armed a force, creating a desperate four-person cell of survival and intelligence. The operation, codenamed silently as the Falcon's Gambit, was about to begin. The fate of the entire Soviet push rested on a half ration of bread, a desperate crawl, and the logistical poetry taught by a dead engineer. The final preparations were excruciatingly slow, each movement a conscious battle against the blinding white heat of the pain. Ivan strapped his useless leg tightly to a piece of splintered timber he found in the cellar, a crude brace designed only to prevent further damage, not to assist movement. He smeared the exposed skin of his face and hands with the oily soot from the old lamp, blending with the shadows and ash of the burned landscape. Anya used the last of the clean water in the rusted pail to wet a piece of cloth, which she stuffed around the rifle's bolt to dampen any metallic sounds. She was preparing for a siege, anticipating Ivan's potential failure. At 1925 hours, the first phase of the plan began. The distant, heavy sound of German voices, muffled by the ruins, signaled the Beta 8 patrol's arrival at the tractor. The 5 minutes of static exposure was their window. Ivan slid out of the cellar, moving in the low crawl, but a crippled, lopsided version. He used his elbows and his right leg, dragging the rest of his weight across the freezing, jagged debris. The cold metal fragments and frozen earth tore at his uniform and skin, but the distant, rhythmic voices of the German soldiers, talking about home, about the mundane horrors of daily life, acted as a metronome for his agony. The German chatter was his cover. Every step he took, every strained breath, was calibrated to the rise and fall of their conversation. The cistern was nestled behind the skeletal remains of the church's stone foundation, a shallow, partially submerged well designed to hold rainwater. Anya's intelligence was perfect. 3 50-gallon drums of high-octane gasoline, used for incinerating field casualties and damaged half-tracks, sat partially obscured by a tattered canvas tarp. Ivan reached the cistern precisely at the 4-minute 30-second mark. His breath was ragged, his muscles screaming, but his mind was pure focus. He had only seconds. He pulled the captured fuse wire from his pack, a thin, green line of death. His hands, though numb with cold, worked with the trained precision of a master craftsman. He used his bayonet to pierce the thinnest metal of the central drum, letting the gasoline weep out onto the frozen ground. He threaded the fuse wire into the hole, ensuring a flammable wick was saturated, and ran the line back, covering it with ash and debris, until he was approximately 15 meters away. He had no timing mechanism, only the approximate burn rate of the wire he remembered from a training exercise years ago. He had to light it, and then he had to run. A crawl. He heard the rising tone of the German voices. Their 5-minute break was over. They were moving. At 1932 hours, the patrol's footsteps started moving away from the cistern. They were heading north, back toward the main road. The window was closing. Ivan activated the ignition. He scraped 2 small flint stones together. The tiny, sparking effort, an immense strain on his exhausted arms. The fuse caught instantly, a tiny, hissing green flame barely visible against the dark earth. He turned and began the crawl of his life toward the only possible cover. The main defensive trench line, abandoned and collapsed, 300 meters away, running parallel to the river. The Mosin Nagant was no longer the weapon of choice. It was a tactical crutch, a heavy stick to push himself forward. He hadn't covered 50 meters when the first explosion hit. It wasn't the fuel drums yet, but the blast had been powerful enough to rip the earth and send shrapnel flying. He had forgotten the volatility of the old fuel. The initial rupture was merely the prelude. The German patrol, now 70 meters away, instantly scattered, yelling in confusion and terror. The sudden, immense noise drowned out Ivan's struggle, but the column of flame rising above the church ruins illuminated the entire landscape in a sickly orange glow. And then, the second, massive detonation. The remaining fuel drums went up in a catastrophic chain reaction. The noise was seismic, a rolling thunder that echoed across the Dnieper, and the air was momentarily filled with a rain of burning oil and shrapnel. The German line, expecting a forward Soviet artillery barrage, was completely disoriented. They hadn't been hit by the Red Army. They had been hit by their own logistics, weaponized by a single crippled man. But the diversion had a critical side effect. The twin German patrol dogs, startled by the explosive shockwave, broke loose from their handler's grasp. Katya's intelligence was tragically confirmed. The new one, untrained and terrified, broke cover and bolted, not toward the fire, but directly toward the only moving object it could sense in the darkness. Ivan. The sniper who had neutralized hundreds of combatants was now being pursued by a single, terrified animal. The dog, its senses overwhelmed by the smell of burning oil and fear, tracked Ivan purely by the smell of his blood and sweat. He heard the frantic barking getting closer, a sound far more terrifying than the distant explosions. A dog meant the German pursuit would now be focused, directed, not just scattering randomly. Ivan looked ahead to the collapsed trench, still 50 meters away. He was too exposed. He knew he could not outrun the animal, nor could he waste his final pistol rounds on a distraction. In the cellar, Anya heard the barking. She knew Ivan's location was betrayed. She had the rifle. She had the sight. But she was a mother, not a killer. Yet, she had a promise to keep. The information had to survive. The camera, in this moment, would focus not on the carnage of the fire, but on the silent, desperate calculation of Anya in the dark. The sniper was exposed. The mother was now the falcon. The game of survival had turned into a deadly lesson in shared responsibility. The dog, a magnificent Belgian shepherd, bounded over the rubble, its silhouette sharp and low against the orange glow of the burning fuel depot. The barking was a focused, relentless sonic arrow pointing directly at Ivan. The German patrol, recovering from the shock, began to realize the nature of the attack. "He is wounded! Look for the track! The dog will find him!" they shouted in the distance. The net was closing. Ivan, pushing off his right heel for a final desperate surge, realized the profound irony. After all the great battles, all the strategic victories, he might be caught, not by an enemy general or a massed assault, but by a dog and a logistical fire he had himself created. In the cellar, Anya was breathing in slow, measured counts, exactly as her engineer father had taught her to stabilize the pressure of a delicate instrument. The Mosin Nagant felt foreign and heavy, but the action was simple, its purpose clear. She had not raised the rifle to her shoulder to kill. She had raised it to protect the intelligence, the Viper coordinates, the minefield specifics that Ivan carried. She used the optical scope, a tool designed for distant, detached death, to focus on the terrain 150 meters away, where Ivan lay. The dog was now 20 meters from him. Too close. Anya steadied the rifle against the cold stone lintel of the cellar opening. Her target was not the dog. It was the frozen ground in front of the dog. A ricochet shot. A technique Ivan had once described in a bored, drunken moment weeks ago. A specialized, low-angle shot designed to scatter stone and debris, distracting the target without killing it. A non-lethal tactical deterrent. She squeezed the trigger. The sound of the rifle shot, amplified in the still night air, cracked like a whip. The 7.62mm round struck a frozen piece of field granite at a perfect shallow angle, 50 centimeters in front of the dog. The impact threw up a blinding plume of powdered ice, stone shrapnel, and pulverized earth. The dog, hit by a sudden, brutal sandblast, yelped in pain and terror, immediately breaking its focus and veering wildly toward the cover of the ruins, away from Ivan. The German soldiers, however, heard the direction of the shot. The source was the burned village. The shot came from the south, from the ruins. They are entrenched. Anya's tactical brilliance, or perhaps just mother's instinct, had paid off. She had diverted the immediate threat to Ivan while simultaneously drawing the enemy's attention to the one place that offered them the most difficulty: the ruins, an area they were already terrified of entering due to the unexploded ordnance and debris. Ivan heard the shot. He heard the dog's whimper. He looked back at the ruins, illuminated by the orange glow, and understood instantly. Anya had sacrificed her concealment to save his life and his mission. He reached the relative safety of the collapsed trench line, sliding down into the frigid dirt, using the debris as a temporary shield. Meanwhile, at the ruins, the German squad, focused on the source of the shot, deployed their heavy weapons. The officer in command, convinced a Soviet sabotage team was hidden there, ordered a volley of rifle grenades into the remains of the cellar. Anya and the children were no longer in the cellar. In the instant after the shot, before the German patrol could fully orient, Anya had grabbed the children and her father's compass and map case and darted out the back of the ruined structure, utilizing a drainage ditch her father had engineered for flood control, a hidden exit known only to them. She knew the logic of the enemy. They would focus on the source of the threat, the rifle shot, not the source of the intelligence, the quiet movement of people. Ivan, concealed in the trench, watched the brutal, senseless bombardment of the cellar. The irony was devastating. He had saved them from starvation only for them to risk their lives for his escape. He had one final task before he could risk the movement across the minefield, confirming the Viper intelligence. He used his field binoculars, adjusted to the minimal light, and focused across the river bend, utilizing the light of the burning cistern. He saw them. 3 immense, high-profile tracked vehicles being towed into their staging positions near the bridge. The long, lethal barrels of the 88mm guns were unmistakable. It was indeed a battery of new Ferdinand anti-tank guns, the Viper, being put into place for the dawn counterattack. The intelligence was valid. The gamble had paid off. The next phase was the crossing. The final, agonizing sprint across a minefield, relying solely on a starving civilian's map. Ivan had to trust Anya's precision. He had to believe in the engineering mind that understood patterns, in the woman who could shoot a perfect warning shot. He pulled himself out of the trench, moving now with only the strength of sheer, desperate will. He was at the edge of the field marked 3 to 4 Alpha on his map, the known gap. But his target was 3 to 4 Beta, the unmarked path, the one that avoided the tension tripwire. He looked back one last time at the burning village. The flames were licking the sky, a beacon of destruction. He had come here, a legendary killer, to find a target. He had left, a wounded refugee having found a conscience.
The true nature of the war was not the technology or the sheer firepower. It was the unpredictable human variable, the compassion of a soldier and the resilience of a mother, colliding at the most dangerous point on the globe. The final stretch of the field, the 150 meters between the abandoned trench and the treacherous, partially iced-over riverbank, was the most perilous terrain of all.
This was the no-man's land defined by the enemy's terror, a hastily laid minefield, supplemented by booby traps and the deadly, unseen tension tripwires. Ivan focused on the map, his eyes tracing the delicate, almost invisible pencil marks Anya had added to the Soviet overlay. The original Soviet intelligence, which he had been ready to trust, showed a clear, straight-line path through the central field. Grid 3-4 Alpha. Anya's lines, however, described a shallow, serpentine arc, hugging the high ground near the river's edge. Grid 3-4 Beta. This arc, she had explained, was not based on avoiding explosives, but on avoiding the vibration sensors. The path led directly over what the German engineers believed was frozen subsoil, stable and dense. But Anya's father, the railway engineer, knew that the river's capillary action created a permanent layer of softer, insulating soil near the bank, a layer that would absorb the subtle pressure of a crawling man, preventing the tension trip wires from registering the movement. This was engineering warfare, a battle between German sensors and a Russian knowledge of local hydrology. Ivan began his agonizing crawl along the prescribed route. Every inch was a conscious gamble. His pain medication was wearing off, and the cold was now a sharp, constant companion. He moved with the slow, almost imperceptible rhythm of a caterpillar, distributing his weight evenly, sliding his body rather than lifting it. He passed the point where the Soviet map indicated the safe zone. His heart hammered in his chest. His military training screamed at him, "You are off route, you are blind." But he trusted Anya's logic, the logical pattern of the enemy's complacency. 10 meters past the safe zone, he found it. A thin, nearly invisible metallic wire stretched taut between two frozen clumps of grass, the tension trip wire at 3-4 Alpha. Had he followed his own map, he would have brushed it. The tiny vibration would have triggered the anti-personnel mine nearby, and the mission, and his life, would have ended in a flash of noise and light. The realization of how close he had come to a meaningless death galvanized his resolve. This was not the war of glorious charges and overwhelming force. This was the war of microscopic detail, of survival by inches and ounces. He reached the riverbank, the air suddenly colder, heavy with the smell of wet ice and moving water. The river itself was a nightmare, partially frozen, the ice too thin to walk on, but thick enough to prevent a clean swim. The current was swift and deadly, strong enough to drag a body beneath the ice in seconds. The crossing point Anya had marked was a small, jutting peninsula of frozen mud, protected from the main current. It was where the German patrols often crossed during low water. He unrolled the few meters of thick rope he had, securing one end to the frozen root of an ancient oak tree, and began to rappel down the steep, slippery bank. The shift in weight sent a blinding lance of pain through his leg, and he cried out, a short, choked sound that was instantly absorbed by the rushing sound of the water. He hit the icy water. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. The cold seized his muscles, stealing his breath. He had to pull himself across the open water, using the rope as a lifeline, dragging his dead weight through the frigid current. He thought of the Viper guns, their lethal profiles waiting on the opposite bank. He thought of the two silent children, trusting him with their survival. He thought of Anya, the mother, the engineer, the accidental sniper. He pulled, muscle fiber tearing, the rope cutting into his hands. He finally reached the opposite bank, his body heavy, numb, and near failure. He collapsed onto the frozen mud, a living, waterlogged ruin. He had made it across the river, the last line of German defense. Now, the final, most crucial element, transmission. He reached into his tunic, pulling out the small, waterproof canister that held his final and most valuable asset. A single sheet of thin tracing paper containing the Viper coordinates, the minefield specifics, and the German patrol rotation times, all translated and verified by Anya. He placed the canister onto a prominent, prearranged marker, a distinctive three-pointed star of stones that only Soviet intelligence scouts were trained to recognize. The pre-dawn infiltration teams, if they were to succeed, would find the intelligence waiting for them. His mission was complete. The Falcon had fallen, risen, and delivered. The last 100 meters of his journey were a blur of instinct and exhaustion. He began to crawl toward the distant friendly lines, a direction indicated by the rising star of a Soviet flare. He heard the faint, beautiful sound of Russian voices in the distance, a sound that, for the first time in days, did not signal a threat, but salvation. He was found by a forward infantry patrol at 400 hours. They found a man, delirious with pain and exposure, dragging himself through the snow, clutching a rifle that did not belong to him. When they asked him who he was, he could only choke out 3 words. The Viper. Beta. He had delivered the message. The intelligence gathered by Ivan Volkov and, more critically, by Anya, the engineer's daughter, arrived at the Soviet command center hours later. It was immediately cross-referenced and confirmed. The logistical poetry of the German supply lines, the rotation of the observation posts, and the fatal hidden placement of the Viper battery, the Ferdinand anti-tank guns, were all exactly as predicted. The impact was immediate and decisive. The planned Soviet armored thrust at dawn was instantly rerouted away from the treacherous river bend, the known minefield, 3-4 Alpha. Simultaneously, a specialized battery of long-range howitzers was brought forward, tasked with targeting the newly designated Viper staging area, based on Anya's logistical calculations of the German artillery park. At 0600 hours, as the dawn broke over the Dnieper bend, the Soviet offensive began. But it was not met with the expected German counterfire. Instead, the skies opened up over the German rear. The Soviet howitzers, firing with chilling, precise accuracy, destroyed the Ferdinand battery before a single 88mm shell could be fired. The Viper was crushed in its lair. The Soviet armored divisions, now following the serpentine, unexpected path identified by the engineer's map, 3-4 Beta, bypassed the minefield entirely, achieving a complete breakthrough on the German flank. The ensuing battle was a stunning victory for the Red Army, accelerating the German retreat from the Dnieper and saving countless lives. Sergeant Ivan Volkov, hospitalized with severe exposure and a shattered leg, was honored not just for his survival, but for the astonishing precision of the intelligence he delivered. But when asked where he acquired the detailed minefield coordinates, he was cryptic, only attributing it to a local observer. He honored his pact of silence. But the story does not end with military glory. The true consequence of Ivan's human encounter lay in the follow-up mission he personally requested, weeks later after his recovery. In the spring of 1944, Ivan Volkov, now permanently walking with a severe limp but reassigned to the Rear Echelon Intelligence Corps, returned to the liberated Dnieper Bend. He was not there for medals or ceremonies. He was there to fulfill a promise. He found the burned village, its ruins now a haunting monument to the violence of the winter campaign. The cellar was completely destroyed. The silence was absolute. He feared the worst. He used the old railway engineer's map, the only piece of evidence he had kept, and walked the trajectory of the drainage ditch Anya had used for escape. He followed the path south for nearly 10 kilometers, until he reached a small, forgotten refugee camp near a rail depot the Soviets were rapidly rebuilding. He searched, not for a soldier, but for an engineer. He found Anya there. She was working in the makeshift camp kitchen, a position that allowed her to observe the new patterns of Soviet logistics. Katya and Boris were playing nearby. They were thin, but they were alive. The children, recognizing the tall, limping man with the haunted eyes, pointed at him. Anya turned. There were no tears, no dramatic embraces. Just the solemn recognition of 2 people who had shared the most profound, desperate contract of human survival. The mission was successful, Ivan said simply, his voice rough. The Viper was neutralized. You saved the division. Anya merely nodded. The pattern was correct. The German engineers always overestimate their own cleverness and underestimate the river. Ivan then extended his hand. He was not offering a medal or a commendation. He was offering a lifeline, a job working with the Soviet Engineering Corps to map the newly captured regions, a role that required a deep, innate understanding of logistics, hydrology, and pattern recognition. A job where her father's training could rebuild the country that the war had shattered. She accepted, not as a hero, not as a spy, but as an engineer fulfilling her potential. She put the small, carved wooden knight back into her pocket, a symbol that precision, order, and human ingenuity, even when disguised by starvation, were the ultimate weapons against chaos. The legacy of the Falcon was not merely the staggering tally of kills credited to Sergeant Volkov, but the life he saved and the intelligence she delivered. It proved that the largest strategic victories in the Second World War were often decided not by the grand pronouncements of field marshals, but by the quiet acts of compassion, the shared knowledge, and the unforeseen connection between a wounded sniper and a starving family in the cellar of a burned village. It was a hidden history that demonstrated the enduring truth of the Eastern Front. The human will, stripped bare of propaganda and glory, was the most resilient and unpredictable force of all. If the untold stories, the strategic ironies, and the profound human drama of the Second World War continue to grip your imagination, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support allows us to keep the light shining on the unwritten chapters of history. Thank you for watching.